Management is Unit 2, which is part of the SCQF Level 8 Diploma in Project Management awarded by EAL. In this video I'm going to go over how to gather evidence towards this unit. Looking at the unit description in the unit guide, states that good project stakeholder relationships are vital to the success of a project and are encouraged through identification, analysis, planning and implementation of actions designed to engage with stakeholders. This unit is at SCQF Level 8 and there's 12 credit values associated with this unit. This unit has two learning outcomes. The first is being able to identify and assess stakeholder relationships, and the second is being able to engage with stakeholders. Let's start with the first criteria, 1.1, research and identify project stakeholders and their areas of interest and influence using a variety of techniques. So this is the first step in the planning stage, where you will identify stakeholders. The first step is to find out who is your stakeholders. Often this can be quite difficult because there's lots of people, individuals or groups of people or even organisations which are a stakeholder, but it's quite difficult to identify them as such. Generally speaking, it is anyone who has an interest or any influence in your project would be considered a stakeholder. So reflect on your experience where you've had to identify stakeholders. What was the project? What technique did you use to identify them? What stakeholders were identified and what techniques have you used to identify their interest and their power? Product evidence would be a stakeholder management plan, perhaps a 2x2 grid or a 4x2 grid. It could also be a power and influence grid. So these are techniques you could use. Other techniques might be to brainstorm, to look at lessons learned from previous projects, to speak with colleagues that might have worked on other projects. And a lot of it involves doing a good bit of research into identifying, so this first one's simply about identifying who your stakeholders are. 1.2, prepare and present a stakeholder map that identifies the relevant stakeholders and their areas of interest and influence in a project. So this is you starting to assess your stakeholders by plotting them on a power and interest grid, or an influence and interest grid. So reflect on your experience carrying out an assessment of stakeholders. What methods did you use? How did you produce the map? Reflect on why you selected this type of assessment and what use it has for your project. Product evidence would be a stakeholder management plan, power impact interest grid, a RACI, organisational breakdown structure and relationship map. All these forms of breakdown structures or diagrams have got some way of documenting your stakeholders, and it could be very useful to include that as evidence that you're able to assess your stakeholders and identify their power and interest. Could be any communication around discussing with colleagues to what extent maybe a particular stakeholder has power or interest or influence in your project. 1.3, assess and classify stakeholders according to their potential impact on a project and identify key stakeholders. So this is about assessing stakeholders' impact. Senior directors are going to have a large impact on your project. For example, people who are lower down the organisation chart are going to have less of an impact, but that's not to say they have no impact. There could be some people who have technical expertise and therefore they'll have quite a lot of impact on a project. So it's important to be able to identify people's influence or stakeholders' impact on a project. So the techniques you'll use will be quite varied. It will depend on your project and your organisation. Reflect on a time when you've assessed and classified stakeholders according to their potential impact on a project. How did you produce the map and why is the map important? What does the map show and who are the key stakeholders? Explain why these stakeholders are key. Product evidence would be a stakeholder management plan, a power impact an interest grid, and benefits mapping as well could fit into this. 1.4, determine and capture threats and opportunities represented by stakeholders and risks of the project. This is linked to backers and blockers. Some stakeholders will back your project, others will try and block your project. Don't make the assumption that everyone is going to be interested in your project and to be supportive of it. It's important to identify what stakeholders are backers and what stakeholders are blockers. There are other techniques you could use as well that is about analysing threats and opportunities represented by stakeholders, and if you've used a different technique, it's also fine to use those techniques for this criteria as evidence. So reflect on your experience where you've analysed risks and threats from stakeholders. What method did you use to analyse these risks? How did you conduct or produce this analysis? What does this analysis show? And what are the main risks or threats? Reflect on why this is useful for your project. Product evidence would be a stakeholder management plan, a risk matrix or risk analysis on stakeholders. 1.5. Develop a stakeholder management plan in parallel with other plans that defines suitable strategies and actions for engaging with project stakeholders. This outcome is about putting all of the stakeholder plan together. So you've identified, you've assessed, you've put together a stakeholder map, you've worked out the risks associated with stakeholders. How do you document that and contribute towards a wider stakeholder management plan? This plan could be a Word document, a PDF, or it could be a PowerPoint, it could be a SharePoint site, or it could be done on your project management software that you're using. So it depends on what your organisation uses and what your organisation processes are as to how this evidence would look. So reflect on a time where you've produced a stakeholder management plan. What was in the stakeholder management plan? How did you identify relevant information and what did you contribute towards the stakeholder management plan? Reflect on your experience putting together the stakeholder management plan. Product evidence would be your stakeholder management plan, which should outline strategies and actions for interacting with stakeholders. First outcome is about project planning. Second outcome, project delivery. So we're now moving on to your projects running and you are managing and communicating with stakeholders. 2.1 is provide stakeholders with suitable opportunities to engage with the project in accordance with the stakeholder management plan. So that is you allowing stakeholders to communicate and have input towards the project management plan. This one could be at the planning stage. You might want to get your stakeholders' input on the plans that you're putting together, or it could be in the project delivery phase where your project's running and you still have to require good communication with stakeholders to get their input and their support. If stakeholders don't get that input, they're likely to turn into a blocker, and that could cause problems for your project. So reflect on a time we've had to communicate with stakeholders to ensure that they're engaged. What was the stage of the project? Why is it important to engage with your stakeholders? Which stakeholders were consulted? Which were kept informed? And how did you identify which was which? Product evidence would be a communications plan. It could be context or pestle analysis. It could be RACI, or it could be any communications where you're communicating with stakeholders, allowing them to engage. Quite a good one for holistic evidence, this criteria. 2.2. Communicate, present and justify relevant information to stakeholders at a suitable time and in a form that meets their needs. This is also an excellent criteria to assess. In fact, this whole outcome is very good to assess holistically where you're communicating. So if you're communicating schedule information, if you're communicating resource information, if you're communicating risks or quality information to stakeholders, then this would cover this point and a lot of this outcome as well, as long as you have enough to cover each point. So this is quite simply communicate, present and justify relevant information to stakeholders, and you're doing that in the right time. And there's a strong link here with the communications unit as well. Reflect on your experience when you've had to communicate or are planning to communicate or present project information to stakeholders. How did you identify which information to present? How was it going to be presented? And when was it going to be presented? What are your reasons for doing this? How did you actually present the information to the stakeholders? Product evidence would be digital communication, email, collaborative tech, instant message, meeting minutes, or a letter. 2.3. Apply influencing, negotiation and conflict management skills to working with project stakeholders. There is an overlap here with the outcome in communication that's about negotiation. This is specific to applying negotiation and conflict management skills to working with stakeholders. In communication, there's an outcome in negotiation and an outcome on conflict management. So holistic evidence should map into this point as well. Around that, so there are links there. Reflect on your experience. We have had to apply influencing, negotiation and or resolve conflict while working with stakeholders. Who were the stakeholders? What was the negotiation over? What was the negotiation strategies? How did you plan the negotiation and what happened during the negotiation? Reflect on the outcome. Product evidence would be negotiation policy, win-win planning, a document outlining acceptable compromises, could be diary invites and emails arranging meetings or calls, meetings or minutes report of negotiations or communications between colleagues discussing conflict or negotiation. 2.4. Engage with stakeholders in order to gain their ongoing commitment in accordance with the communications management plan. Reflect on your experience you've had to get stakeholder engagement. Why was it important to get stakeholder engagement? What are the risks if stakeholders weren't engaged? What is the plan set out in your communications plan for communication? Who, when, how, what and why. So that's your basis of your communication plan. They're the key elements of any communication plan. and what was the stakeholders' response. Again, there's a strong link with your communications unit, and if you're communicating information about any other aspects of project management such as risk, quality, finance, then there's excellent opportunity here for holistic assessment if you can prove that you're engaging with stakeholders around those areas. Key part of this is about getting their commitment, so you're ensuring that all your stakeholders are committed to the project and they're on side. Product evidence would be perhaps a section from your stakeholder management plan, your communications management plan. It could be communication itself, it could be a plan in action showing communications, it could be meeting or diary invites, for example. 2.5, proactively manage threats and opportunities represented by stakeholders as risks to the project. There's an overlap here, or a link between this criteria and the risk management unit. So if you've already done the risk management unit, there could be opportunity for holistic assessment, where if the risks that you're managing are stakeholders or particular stakeholders, then that should be able to cover this point if your evidence is broad enough to cover this, if there's enough there. So reflect on your experience when you've had to influence, negotiate and or manage conflict with a stakeholder. What was the situation? What techniques did you use? How did the stakeholder respond? What was the outcome? How did this affect stakeholder management as a whole for the project? Product evidence is a stakeholder management plan, risk management plan, or SWOT analysis. Could also be communication if you're actively communicating or sending documents to stakeholders to try and get them on side or to minimise the risk, if you're putting actions in place to minimise the risk. 2.6, maintain and update the stakeholder management plan according to the changing dynamics of stakeholder involvement. There is links here to your other PM units where you are updating the project management plan. So for example, you're updating the stakeholder management plan, you're updating the schedule management plan, risk management plan, quality management plan. If there's an element there of stakeholders changing as well, that could also be used as holistic evidence. This is specifically to do with stakeholders though, so keep that in mind. So for example, a stakeholder might have been promoted within your organisation and they are more influential, therefore you have to change the communication methods that you're going to use with that stakeholder. Or a different organisation has been selected as a supplier, so that's a new stakeholder. Perhaps you're doing a construction project and you've overlooked maybe a community organisation that's made up of local residents. That would also have to be included. If local residents put together some sort of group, you'd have to then include them as a stakeholder, add that into the plan and manage your communication, manage how you're going to approach that. So reflect on your experience when you've updated the stakeholder management plan as the project has progressed. What is the procedure for updating and communicating changes and updates to the stakeholder management plan? What were the changes and updates? And how did you adhere to the correct procedure? Product evidence is an updated stakeholder management plan or an excerpt from your change control procedure. 2.7, maintain compliance with the required levels of confidentiality and with standards of professional practice. This is specific within the context of stakeholder management. So this is essentially adhering to data protection rules, GDPR rules, which are legal requirements. You may also have organisational requirements around how information is managed. This could be things such as keeping information saved in the correct location, not making copies, using certain documents or templates, naming standards, setting passwords, access privileges to the software so only certain people can access information about stakeholders. And also you might have professional practice, so the Association for Project Managers, APM, they will have a code of conduct, and in there is standards of professional practice around confidentiality, data protection, and so you want to gather evidence that shows that you comply with this when you're managing stakeholders. Reflect on your experience when you're interacting with stakeholders. What was the situation and how did you maintain the required levels of confidentiality? What are the required levels of confidentiality and why should this be followed? I've mentioned what the rules are in terms of legal, organisational and professional practice, but it's important that you're not just providing evidence that you know what they are. You must show that you are taking action and you're applying that in the workplace. This is about proving your skills in the workplace. So you need to be able to perform an activity which is actually following those rules. It's not enough just to be able to evidence that you know what those rules are. Product evidence would be a reference. You could use reference in policies and law, legal procedures, or your code of conduct for APM as evidence that you know what they are. But remember, you have to go further and show your ongoing compliance with that. That could be a screenshot of you following that procedure, could be communication of you following that procedure. Thanks for listening, and hopefully that helps you to gather evidence for this unit.